What kind of leader runs away from the spotlight and still ends up in it? What happens when the world's most powerful religious role finds a man who never wanted power? And why did a quiet priest from Argentina who called himself a sinner become one of the most beloved popes of our time? Before the white robes, before the world watched his every move, before the name Francis echoed from balconies across Rome, there was just a man named Jorge Mario Bergoglio. He came from the humblest of beginnings, born in Buenos Aires, Argentina, to a working-class family. While others dreamed of legacy and leadership, he found comfort in silence, in service, in listening. Bergoglio never chased titles. He didn't seek elevation. While many in his position might have viewed advancement as a spiritual promotion, he viewed it with caution, even suspicion. Friends remember him not for his ambition, but for his authenticity. They speak of a man who preferred shadows to stages, who spoke softly and prayed deeply, who believed leadership should never be about command, but about presence. For Bergoglio, the very idea of becoming pope seemed almost absurd. Not because he lacked the qualifications, but because he didn't crave the role. When conversations drifted toward the possibility in whispers behind Vatican doors, he would gently dismiss it. He once said with striking honesty, "I am a sinner. This is the most accurate definition. It is not a figure of speech, a literary genre. I am a sinner." And yet, perhaps it was that very humility, that raw, unpolished self-awareness that made the world take notice. In a time of noise, he was silence. In a time of grandeur, he was grounded. In a time of spectacle, he was soul. And so, as fate would have it, the man who never asked for power became the man called to wield it. But the story doesn't begin with a title. It begins with a calling, a quiet, reluctant calling that would change not just his life, but the face of the Catholic Church. As we turn the page, we journey back to the streets of Buenos Aires, where this calling first took root not in marble halls, but in marketplaces and public buses. Not in ambition, but in purpose. In Argentina, Bergoglio wasn't a cardinal hidden behind gates. He was a man among people. He didn't just pay visits to the poor for photos or tradition. He sat with them. He stayed with them. He prayed beside hospital beds. He stepped into the messiness of real life with sleeves rolled up and heart wide open. Instead of black sedans, he rode public buses, shoulder to shoulder with strangers. He shopped for groceries like anyone else. He walked the same cracked sidewalks, unaccompanied and unnoticed by most. In a world where status often builds walls, Bergoglio chose doors. Doors he opened with his own hands. His meals weren't served. He cooked them himself. He didn't have a private driver. He preferred the simplicity of moving at the speed of the people. To those around him, he wasn't a distant figure in red robes. He was a neighbor, a listener, a companion in struggle. And this is what made his faith so powerful. It wasn't academic. It wasn't theoretical. It was tangible, lived, real. His theology wasn't written in books alone. It was written in the faces of the people he served. During those formative years, something was taking root within him. Not the hunger for position, but the quiet, organic growth of leadership grounded in empathy. He didn't climb the ladder of status. He dug deep into the soil of service. But as he served, others watched. And the church, ever in search of leaders, began to notice. Titles and promotions were offered. And every time, he paused. Bergoglio never leapt toward promotion. He hesitated. He wrestled. Because for him, leadership in the church was not something to be claimed. It was something to be received with trembling hands and a cautious heart. He understood something many forget. The higher you rise, the easier it is to lose sight of what's below. The more people bow to you, the harder it becomes to kneel with them. In 2005, his name came up during the conclave that would eventually elect Pope Benedict XVI, and those close to him say he quietly prayed that the role would pass him by. He wasn't afraid of responsibility. He was afraid of disconnection. Disconnection from the streets, from the people, from God. But fate, it seems, doesn't always listen to prayers of avoidance. As we move into the next chapter, we'll witness the moment everything changed when the world chose him, and the man who had spent his life saying no was asked to say yes. From the streets of Buenos Aires to the marble halls of the Vatican, the contrast could not have been starker, and yet Jorge Mario Bergoglio was about to step into a moment that would echo across history. The 13th of March, 2013. The world waited. The square was packed. Eyes were glued to television screens. White smoke rose from the chimney of the Sistine Chapel. The centuries-old ritual had spoken. A new pope had been chosen, Habemus Papam, and then a name never before spoken from the papal balcony, Francis. Inside the Sistine Chapel, Bergoglio had just accepted the papacy. But this was not a moment of glory. It was a moment of gravity. Witnesses say he didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply sat in silence for several long minutes, hands folded, head bowed, breathing slowly, as if the weight of the world had just been placed on his shoulders and he was listening for strength. When asked whether he accepted, his words were not triumphant. They were trembling. "I am a sinner, but I trust in the mercy of God." There were no cheers in that moment, no victory speeches, just stillness, deep, sacred stillness. And so, the man who had run from power became the man entrusted with it. The hours that followed revealed even more. As reporters scrambled to cover his first acts, they expected a limousine ride, a grand procession, a move into the Vatican Palace. That's what popes had always done. But Francis? He did none of that. He declined the limo. He rode back to the guest house with the other cardinals sitting among them as an equal, not above them as their head. He returned to the hotel where he had stayed prior to the conclave. He paid his own bill at the front desk. And when offered the papal apartments in the Apostolic Palace with their gold ceilings and centuries of history, he gently refused. That night, Pope Francis slept not in a palace, but in a modest guest room. Alone, quiet, still. It was his first decision as Pope, and it said everything. This would not be a papacy of distance. This would not be a reign of pomp. This would not be a pope perched above. It would be a pope among. It was a message whispered through action. I have not come to be served, but to serve. As we move forward, we'll explore how this first choice to live humbly became a symbol of a deeper philosophy, one that would shake centuries of tradition and redefine what it means to lead in the modern world. From the silence of his first night as Pope, we move into one of his boldest decisions, not spoken from a pulpit, but lived in where he chose to rest his head. The Apostolic Palace has long been a symbol of papal authority. Towering, ornate, and rich with history, it was designed to reflect the glory of God, or, as some would argue, the grandeur of men. Marble floors stretch beneath frescoed ceilings. Every inch whispers tradition and power. And yet, Pope Francis looked at all that magnificence and quietly said no. Instead, he chose the Domus Sanctae Marthae, a guest house tucked within the Vatican grounds, a place far simpler, far humbler, a space where cardinals often stayed during conclave, but never a pope. It was a move that stunned insiders. Why give up the palace? Why choose a room with plain walls over one adorned in gold? But Francis saw something that others didn't. In the splendor of the palace, he saw a subtle danger, the danger of becoming unreachable, of drifting into separation, of being revered, but no longer touched. He believed that proximity was not optional for a shepherd, it was essential. He said it plainly. A shepherd must smell like his sheep. In Domus Sanctae Marthae, he could eat meals in community. He could walk the hallways with staff and visitors. He could open his own doors. And more importantly, he could remain human in a role that so often turns people into symbols. He wasn't rejecting beauty. He was rejecting distance, the kind of distance that makes leaders untouchable and holiness inaccessible. Because leadership for Francis was never about height. It was about nearness. But not everyone saw this as noble. Within the walls of the church, his decisions sparked discomfort. Some called his choices disruptive. Others whispered that he was diminishing the dignity of the papacy. A few labeled him too modern, too casual, too political. But Francis wasn't interested in looking papal. He was interested in being present. He washed the feet of prisoners, even Muslims. He embraced those the world had hidden away, people with disfigured faces, the chronically ill, the forgotten. He spoke more of mercy than judgment. He challenged the rich. He critiqued systems of privilege, even within the church itself. To traditionalists, it felt unsettling. To others, it felt like the gospel come alive. Francis wasn't trying to win the approval of the church. He was trying to wake it up, to shake it from its comfort, to remind it and all of us that faith without humility is noise, and that leadership without compassion is a contradiction. As we move forward, we'll examine how this disruptive humility didn't stop at symbolism but became the very foundation of how Francis chose to lead the world's largest religious institution. From his humble room and grounded rituals, a different kind of influence began to unfold, one that didn't require loud proclamations, only quiet consistency. Over time, the world began to notice. But not because he changed church doctrine. He didn't rewrite theology or overhaul tradition. What he changed was tone. In a world flooded with noise, his gentleness rang out. In an institution long associated with hierarchy and rules, his posture softened the edges. His tone, compassionate, measured, sincere, reminded people that spiritual authority could still speak in a human voice. He made people feel seen, not as problems to be solved or sinners to be judged, but as souls to be honored. He made people feel heard, not in grand audiences, but in small, quiet encounters where his eyes met theirs and lingered. He made people feel loved, deeply, freely, without condition. Francis used his platform to speak about the forgotten, the planet in crisis, the poor in silence, the refugees in flight, the elderly in loneliness, the youth lost in digital distraction. He crossed boundaries, religious, political, social. He visited mosques, synagogues, and refugee camps. He spoke not just as a Catholic, but as a human being. And always, always, he returned to one word: mercy. Not judgment, not control. Mercy. In doing so, he did something few leaders ever manage. He took one of the highest roles on earth and made it feel reachable. He didn't lead as a king, he led as a man. And that, perhaps, is the quiet revolution of Francis. He made the papacy less about elevation being above and more about incarnation being among, less about power and more about presence, Because when you don't crave power, you hold it differently. You don't clutch it with fear. You don't use it to dominate. You let it pass through you to serve, not to shine. Francis never wanted to be Pope, and that may be the very reason his leadership feels so sincere, so grounded, so real. He doesn't perform, he shows up. He doesn't lecture, he listens. He doesn't rule, he invites. This isn't charisma, it's character. And in a world exhausted by spectacle, the curated image, the loud brand, the performance of leadership realness doesn't whisper, it heals. As we step into the final chapter of this story, we'll ask not just what Francis taught us about leadership, but what he reflects back to us about ourselves. We all face moments when life asks more of us than we were prepared to give. It may not be a throne, it may not come with robes or rituals, but it will come in the form of a decision, a calling, an opportunity that feels too heavy, too uncertain, too much. And in those moments, remember Francis. Remember the man who walked away from power, only for it to find him again. The man who didn't ask for the role, didn't campaign for it, didn't crave the spotlight, and yet, when the world called, he said yes. Not because he wanted recognition, not because he sought legacy, but because he believed in love. Because sometimes, the most powerful yes, the one that shapes history, is the one whispered, not shouted. Francis said yes, quietly, humbly. And through that yes, he changed not just the papacy, but what it means to lead with soul. So, the next time life asks something big of you, pause, breathe, and ask yourself, is this your moment to say yes, not for attention, but for alignment, not for prestige, but for presence? Because your quiet yes might be louder than you think. I mean you. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments. Your voice matters here. Share this video with someone who might be facing their own moment of decision. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Mindful Way Television, where we tell stories that move the soul, not just the screen. In our next video, we'll explore another quiet act of leadership. One hug, one man, one world-changing moment. Until then, stay grounded, stay brave, and keep walking your mindful way.